like and subscribe to this video. Also give me a comment on what you'd like to see in future videos. In addition, hit the little bell button so you'll be notified as to when future videos will show up. And of course, share the video. Alright, thank you very much. Okay, now we're going to melt the 92.5% silver with 7.5% copper to make the ingot for this ring. Now we're going to take the ingot to the rolling mill and we're going to roll down a 1.5 millimeter thick sheet by 50 millimeters wide, and we're going to make it as long as that will go. Periodically we're going to anneal the metal by heating it up to a nice red glow and then letting it cool. This will make the metal nice and malleable so it won't crack when we run it to the rolling mill. And we're going to measure out the dimensions for the shank, and we're going to make it into a perfect rectangle. Once we describe on the dimensions of the rectangle, we're going to cut the rectangle with the jeweler's saw. We're also going to sand and buff the rectangle sheets until they're nice and perfectly square in all its dimensions. Okay, we're also going to measure out the sheets for the top plate as well. So we're going to measure out the sheets for all the facets of the ring. Top plate, the shank, and the front and back plates. Of course, we're going to cut out all of these rectangular sheets with the jeweler's saw and get them ready for assembly. Once we have all the sheets perfectly square and cleaned up really nice and perfect, what we're going to do is bend the metal to make the shape of the shank. Using a vise and a dap tool, cylindrical dap tool, we're going to bend the metal around the dap tool to make the shape of the shank for the ring. Once we have our sheet bent for the shank, we're going to measure off the sides of the shank to make sure that they're perfectly even with each other. And we're going to be left with a perfect U shape. Make sure when you do your cutting and filing to cut and file the shank on perfect right angles so that there's no tilt or slant to the ring, so they'll fit perfectly on the finger when we're finished. We're going to print out the type that we're going to have on the top of the ring and glue a laser print of the type onto a thick piece of metal that's about 2.5 millimeters thick. Then we're going to saw that down later to be the raised relief type on the ring. We're going to file down the shank plate nice and flat so they'll fit nice and flat on the top plate. Also, we're going to make sure that the top plate is very clean, so we're going to buff that as well so that the solder will flow and adhere the plates together very strongly. We're going to flux the solder, and we're going to flux the plate and the shank. So again, the solder will flow and adhere the plates nice and strongly. We're going to position the shank on top of the plate, and we're going to take our time to get it nice and perfect on the plate. Once we get it there, we're going to preheat the metal so that the flux can kind of hold the metal still. Add a little bit of flux with the paintbrush just to make sure the flux is in all of the crevices. And we're going to heat the metal, and then we're going to add the solder. In this case, we're going to use hard solder, which has the highest melting points, because we have various stages that's going to have to go one upon the other in terms of soldering the assembly of the final ring together. Once the metal is almost red hot, then we know it's at the right temperature for the hard solder, which has the highest melt and flow temperature, to flow and combine the pieces together. Now we're going to cut off the excess metal, file it and buff it, get it nice and clean for the next stages. I always start on the top flat dimension of the metal and establish a groove. Then I slowly start angling my saw on a 45-degree angle. This helps me to cut a very straight line. Okay, once we have the basic shape cut out with the saw, we're going to use the file to clean up the shape, and then we're going to buff the shape to clean it further so we can have a nice, seamless shank to top plate connection. You're going to be buffing the ring with finer and finer grit paper until the seam where the solder is totally disappears. Now we're going to use the jeweler saw to cut out the type that's glued to the type plate. We're going to be very careful and try to do a very precise job cutting out the type. Okay, to get the space in the middle of the type, like an A and an ara and between the type, we're going to use a Dremel tool with a drill bit, and we're going to just cut a very fine hole that the saw blade can fit in. Then we're going to feed the saw blade through the hole so that we can cut out the spaces between the type. Once we have the type cut out, we're going to use some water, warm water, to melt the glue to release the paper from the type, and then we're going to clean the type up, and we're going to just try to position it to get a visualization of how it's going to look on the top of the ring. And also we're going to use the file to make the final adjustments so that the type is framed on the top plate perfectly. We're going to carefully measure out to find the center line for the center of the shank, and use the scribe and the magic marker, and with some careful measuring and using also the dividers, we're going to scribe in the lines by which we're going to use to cut the shank into a trapezoidal or a pyramidal type of shape. Once we have our lines in place, drawn with the magic marker, and also I like to also scribe my lines in, just in case the magic marker wears off, I can still see where I'm cutting. Once the main shape of the ring is cut and filed nice and flat to fit flush on a flat plate, we're going to solder the flat plate that will make the front plate onto the shank and top plate of the ring. Using the jeweler's file, we're going to file off the excess metal for the front plate that we just soldered onto the main assembly. After we have the main shape filed down nice and flush, we're going to also buff the ring down with finer and finer grit paper again, so the seam of the solder is invisible to the eye. We're going to find the center of the front plate, then we're going to position our divider so we can measure out a hole that's going to be the ring size for the front plate. we're going to drill a hole into the front plate so that we can insert our saw blade through, and then we're going to cut out the hole, pierce the hole out with the jeweler saw. Now we're going to solder on the back plate just as we've done with the front plate. This time we're going to use medium easy solder, which has a lower melt point than the medium hard solder that we use in the stage before this for the front plate. We're going to saw off the excess metal, then we're going to file it, and we're going to buff it to clean up the excess metal, and again to make the solder joints seamless. It's very important to find the center of the piece so that we can make a perfectly aligned hole in the back plate that will be a size 11. We're going to do a technique called sweat soldering, where we take some easy solder now and we're going to pre-melt the solder onto the plates that we cut the type into, and this way we'll have melted solder covering all of the area of the type. And then what we're going to do is clean that solder up. We're going to pickle it, and then we're going to buff it with some buff paper and clean it up. Then we're going to be able to position this type onto the top plate and make our final solder. Once we have the type plates sweat soldered, we're going to pickle it, then we're going to buff it with some fine buff paper to get it nice and flat and clean. And then also what we're going to do is flux the top plate, and we're going to flux the text plate, and we're going to carefully position the text plate onto the top plate to get it in the perfect position. Then we're going to apply the heat and melt the text plate onto the top plate. After the solder is finished, we're going to pickle the assembly and we're going to buff the assembly to get the final finish. We're going to use a finer and finer paper until we're up to about a 1200 grit buff paper. We're going to use a fine brush to paint in the recesses of the piece to make the type stand out. This would darken and oxidize the background, and then we're going to buff the type so it'll be a nice bright silver color. Please like and subscribe to this video. Also give me a comment on what you'd like to see in future videos. Also, if you comment on how I can improve my videos, that would be very much appreciated. In addition, hit the little bell button so you'll be notified as to when future videos will show up. And of course, share the video. Alright, thank you very much.